Topic 1. Whose example should Christians follow or imitate? In 1 Corinthians 4:16, 1 Corinthians 11:1, and Philippians 3:17, Paul tells his followers to imitate him and follow his example. The disciples of Jesus, John and Peter, would disagree. In 1 Peter 2:21, Peter says Jesus is the example for Christians to follow. And in 1 John 2:6, John says that those who claim to live in Jesus should live as Jesus did. Topic 2. Should Christians call any man father? In 1 Corinthians 4:15, Paul claimed he became the father of his followers. That's a rather strange thing to say, because in Matthew 23:9, Jesus explicitly said to not call any man father. How could Paul, who claimed to have received his gospel from Jesus, not know this? Topic 3. Who was the apostle to the Gentiles? In Romans 11:13 and Ephesians 3:8, Paul arbitrarily declares himself the apostle to the Gentiles, and that he was granted the grace to preach to the Gentiles. However, in Acts 15:7, we see that Peter was chosen to preach the gospel to the Gentiles. Topic 4. Are there two separate gospels for the circumcised and uncircumcised? In Galatians 2:7, Paul asserts that there were two distinct gospels, one for the circumcised, that is, the Jews, and another for the uncircumcised, meaning the Gentiles. He also claimed that he was specifically entrusted with preaching the gospel to the uncircumcised, while Peter was designated to preach to the circumcised. However, this arbitrary division of labor does not exist in the gospel account. In Mark 16:15, Jesus instructed his disciples to preach the gospel to every creature, which included the circumcised and the uncircumcised, meaning there was only one gospel, and the original disciples had the task of preaching it to all people. Topic 5. Can one earn from preaching the gospel? In 1 Corinthians 9:13-14, Paul claims that the Lord has commanded that preachers of the gospel should receive their earning from it. According to Paul, all those filthy rich pastors who make millions by preaching the gospel are doing nothing wrong. I'm not sure where Paul gets the idea that the Lord commanded preachers to earn from the gospel, but there's good reason to believe Jesus would have a problem with it. In Matthew 10:8, Jesus taught that spiritual service should be given without payment. Moreover, in Matthew 10:9-11, he instructed his disciples to live off the charity of other people. It does not seem that Jesus advocated for earning money through spiritual work. Topic 6. Is eating food offered to idols a big deal? In 1 Corinthians 8:4-8, Paul downplays the severity of eating foods offered to idols, saying food does not bring us near to God. We are no worse if we do not eat, and no better if we do. While Paul doesn't explicitly condone it, he clearly treats it as a trivial matter, making it seem like it wasn't something to be too concerned about. It was, however, a big deal according to the Apostle James, who in Acts 15:20 warns new converts against eating foods offered to idols. The practice is also condemned in Revelation 2:14 and Revelation 2:20. If Paul were truly a genuine apostle, he wouldn't have taken such a casual attitude towards such a serious issue. Topic 7. Are people justified by faith or works? In Romans 3:28 and Ephesians 2:8-9, Paul claims that a person is justified through faith apart from works of the law, and that people are saved through faith. But the Apostle James teaches something entirely different. In James 2:17-24, he emphasizes the importance of works and teaches that faith without action is dead, and faith without deeds is useless. He goes on to teach that men are considered righteous by their actions and not just by faith. Essentially, his argument is that faith and works go hand in hand. Topic 8. Are Christians saved by declaring Jesus as Lord? In Romans 10:9, Paul taught that anyone who declares Jesus as Lord and believes the right things about Jesus will be saved. However, Jesus objects to the idea that merely calling him Lord and believing things about him is enough to be saved. In Matthew 7:21, Jesus says, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father in heaven." Once again, we see that deeds and works matter. but Paul had different ideas. Topic 9. Is the law still in effect? In Romans 6:14, Paul taught that people are no longer under the law. In Romans 7:4-6, he claimed that people have been released from the law and no longer need to live by the written law, that is, the Torah. Clearly, Paul was unaware of what Jesus had to say about the law. In Matthew 5:17-19, Jesus warned people against thinking he had come to do away with the law. He goes on to say that every bit of the law would remain, and that a person's rank in the kingdom of heaven is determined by their attitudes towards the law. Topic 10. What commandment fulfills the law? In Galatians 5:14, Paul writes that all the law is fulfilled in just one commandment: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. He does something similar in Romans 13:8-9, where he seemingly summarizes the commandments and concludes that love fulfills the law. Now, wait a minute. Isn't Paul forgetting something? Like something really important? Let Jesus remind you. In Matthew 22:37-40, Jesus says that all the law depends on not one but two commandments. First, the commandment to love the Lord with all your heart and soul, which Jesus called the greatest commandment, and second, the commandment to love your neighbor as yourself. Yet Paul, for some reason, decided to omit the greatest commandment. Topic 11. Does having the Holy Spirit free one from the law? In Galatians 5:18, Paul taught that people who are led by the Spirit are not under the law. But in Ezekiel 36:27, God says that having the Spirit moves people to follow the law. Paul contradicted God himself. To conclude, the 11 examples shown in this video should suffice to prove that Paul's teachings were at odds with many of the other books in the Bible. Like, seriously, it's astonishing how Paul could contradict the other books of the Bible on so many crucial topics. This should raise a multitude of red flags about the legitimacy of Paul's apostleship.